49. Lorena didn't see the man come. She wasn't asleep or even thinking about sleep. What she was thinking was that it was about time for Jake to show up. Much as he liked card playing, he liked his carrot better. He'd be back before long. Then, without her hearing a step or feeling any danger, Blue Duck was standing in front of her, the rifle still held in his big hand like a toy. She saw his legs and the rifle when she looked up, but a cloud had passed over the moon. She couldn't see his face. Not at first. A cold fear struck her. She knew she'd been wrong not to go to the cow camp. She'd even sent the boy away. She should have gone. But she had the silly notion that Jake would show up and scare the bandit off if he came back. "Let's get it," Blue Duck said. He'd already caught her horse without her hearing. Lorena felt so scared she was afraid she couldn't walk. She didn't want to look at the man. She might start running and then he would kill her. He had the worst voice she'd ever heard. It was low, like the lowing of that bull she kept hearing at night, but there was death in it too. She looked down for a moment at the bedding. She'd been combing her hair and her little box with the comb in it was there, but the man pushed her toward the horse. "No thanks. We'll travel light," he said. She managed to mount, but her legs were shaking. She felt his hand on her ankle. He took a rawhide string and tied her ankle to her stirrup, then went around the other side and tied it too. "I guess that'll hold you," he said, and caught the pack horse. Then they were moving. Her horses snubbed to his by a short rope. To the west, where the cow camp was, she heard shouts and the drumming sound of the cattle running. Blue Duck rode right toward the sound. In a minute, they were in the running cattle. Lorena was so frightened she kept her eyes closed, but she could feel the heat of the animals' bodies. Then they were through the cattle. She looked, hoping to see Gus or one of the cowboys, anyone who might help her, but she saw no one. When the sound of the stampede died, Lorena let go of all hope. She had been stolen by a man Gus said was bad. The man put the horse into a lope, and it seemed to Lorena they were going to lope forever. Blue Duck didn't look back and didn't speak. At first, she was only conscious of how scared she was, though she felt flickers of anger at Jake for letting it happen. She knew it was as much her fault as Jake's, but she soon stopped caring whose fault it was. She knew she was as good as dead and would never get to see San Francisco, the one thing she'd always looked forward to. Soon even that loss and the prospect of death ceased to mean much. She grew so tired. She had never ridden so hard. Before morning, all she could think of was stopping, although for all she knew, when they did stop, something bad would happen. But in time, it came to seem to be worth it, just to stop. Yet when they did stop, in the faint dawn, it was only for 5 minutes. They had crossed many creeks during the night. Her legs had been wet several times. In a little creek scarcely 5 feet wide, he decided to let the horses water. He untied Lorena's ankles and nodded for her to get down. She did and almost fell. Her limbs were so weak and numb. It was dark in the little creek bed, but light on the ridge above it. As she stood by her horse, holding on to a stirrup until some feeling came back into her legs, Blue Duck opened his trousers and made water, while the horses drank. "Get to it if you plan to," he said, hardly looking at her. Lorena couldn't. She was too scared, and it didn't occur to her to drink, an omission she would soon regret. Blue Duck drank and then motioned for her to mount again. He quickly tied her ankles. They were moving again as the dawn came. At first, the light made her hopeful. Jake or somebody might be riding after them. They might pass a town or farm. Somebody might see that she was being stolen. But the country they rode through was completely empty. It was a country of rocky hills and ridges and hot, cloudless sky. A blankness came to her, replacing her foolish hope. Blue Duck never looked back. He seemed to be taking the horses through the roughest country he could find, but he never slackened his pace. As the day grew hotter, she became thirsty, so thirsty that it was painful to remember that she had stood near a creek and hadn't drunk. She could remember the sound the creek made as it ran over the rocks. At moments it haunted her. Most of the time she was too tired to remember anything. It seemed to her the horses would die if they just rode all day. They rode at a steady trot. In time she regretted, too, that she had not relieved herself. She had been too scared. Hours passed, and they crossed creek after creek, but the man didn't stop again. He just kept riding. The need to relieve herself became an agony. It was mixed with thirst and fatigue until she didn't know which was worse. Then she realized that her pants were wet and her thighs stinging. She had gone while she was dozing. Soon her thighs felt scalded from the urine and the constant rubbing of the saddle. The pain was minor compared to her thirst. During the afternoon, with the sun beating down so hot that her shirt was as wet from sweat as if she'd swum a river in it, she thought she was going to break down, that she would have to beg the man for water. Her lips were cracked and the sweat off her face ran into the cracks and stung her, but she licked at it. At least it was wet, and even a second of wetness on her tongue felt good. She'd never been so thirsty in her life and not imagined it could be such a pain. The most terrible part was when they crossed water, for creeks were numerous. She would look down at the water as they crossed and she wanted to beg. She leaned over at one of the deeper creeks, trying to get a little water in her hand, but she couldn't reach it, though it splashed beneath the horse's belly. She cried then, tears mingling with sweat. Her head throbbed from the beating sunlight, and she began to lose hold of life for minutes at a time. She felt she might cross over. What a joke it would be on the man if, when he got her wherever he was taking her, she was dead. He wouldn't get much from her dead. But she didn't die. She got thirstier and thirstier. Her tongue began to bother her. It seemed to fill her mouth, and when she licked the drops of sweat, it felt as large as her hand. Then, as she was dreaming of water, she opened her eyes to find that they were stopped by a sizable stream. Blue Duck was untying her ankles. "I'd see you wet your pants," he said. Lorena didn't care what he said. Her legs wouldn't work, but she wanted the water so bad she crawled to it, getting her pants muddy in her arms. She couldn't drink fast enough, and gulping the water, she got some up her nose. While she was drinking, Blue Duck waded in beside her and pulled her up by her hair. "Don't drink so fast," he said. "You'll founder." Then he pushed her head under and held it there. Lorena thought he meant to drown her and tried to grab his legs to pull herself out, but evidently he just wanted to give her a bath, because he soon let go and walked to the horses. Lorena sat in the water, her clothes soaked, not caring. She drank until she couldn't drink any more. Blue Duck had unsaddled the horses, and they were standing in the river drinking. When she waded out of the river, Blue Duck was sitting under a tree, chewing on a piece of dried meat. He fished in his saddlebags and gave her a piece. Lorena didn't feel hungry, but then she remembered she had not felt thirsty that morning either. She took the piece of jerky. "We'll rest a spell till it's dark," he said. She looked at the sun, which was not high. It wouldn't be much of a rest. She nibbled at the meat, which was so hard her teeth could barely dent it. She went and sat in the shade of a small tree growing by the creek. Blue Duck hobbled the horses, then came and looked down at her. "I got a treatment for women that try to run away," he said casually. "I cut a little hole in their stomachs and pull out a gut and wrap it around a limb. Then I drag them for 30 or 40 feet to tie them down. That way they can watch the coyotes come and eat their guts." He went back and lay down under a tree, adjusted his saddlebags for a pillow, and was soon asleep. Lorena was too tired for his threat to scare her much. She wasn't going to run away and give him a reason to cut a hole in her stomach. She did think she was going to die, though. She felt death had come for her, in the form of the Comanchero. She wouldn't live to be cut or gnawed by coyotes. She would die if he touched her, she felt. She was too tired to care much. The one thing that crossed her mind was that she should have gone with Xavier. He was a man of his word, no worse in more respects than other men, and yet she had determined to go riding off with Jake, who had not even looked after her 3 weeks. Jake was probably still in Austin playing cards. She didn't particularly blame him. Playing cards beat most things you could do. She dozed for what seemed like a minute and woke up to find Blue Duck shaking her. It was dusk, the sun just down. "Let's get," he said. "We don't want to miss the cool of the evening." Once again they rode all night. Lorena slept in the saddle and would have fallen off if she hadn't been tied in the stirrups. At dawn he let her down again by another creek, and this time she did as he did, peed and drank. They rode all day again through empty country, never seeing a horseman, a town, even an animal. The only thing she noticed was that there were fewer trees. She grew so tired of riding that she would have been glad to die, if only because it meant being stopped. She wanted sleep more than she'd ever wanted anything. The sun blazed all day. When she dozed, sweat stood on her eyelids and wet her face when she awoke. Blue Duck took so little interest in her that she couldn't understand why he'd stolen her. He scarcely looked back all day. He untied her when they stopped, tied her again when they mounted. Once drinking at a creek, there was barely a trickle. The hand she was bracing herself with slipped, and she got mud on her nose. The sight seemed to amuse him slightly. "Monkey John will like that yellow hair," he said. "He'll 'bout have to marry you when he sees that." Later, as he was tying her back to her horse, he mentioned her hair again. "It's too bad the tribe's played out," he said. "A few years back, all I would have to do was scalp you. I could have got a bunch for a scalp like yours." He reached up and idly fingered her hair. "I hope that goddamn old ranger hurries along," he said. "I owe him a few." "Gus?" she said. "Gus won't come. I ain't his." "He's coming," Blue Duck said. "I don't know if it's for you or for me, but he's coming. I'd have just gut you and leave you here and let him bury whatever the buzzards and the varmints don't eat." Lorena didn't look at him for fear that if she looked, he'd do it. "Only I told the boys I'd bring them a woman," he said. "I doubt they thought I'd find the likes of you. They'll probably give me the most of their money and all the hides when they see you." That day her mare played out. She'd been stumbling more and more as she tired. In the heat of the afternoon she stopped and stood with her head down. "I guess whoever picked this one was just planning to ride to church," Blue Duck said. He untied Lorena and put her on the pack horse. They rode off and left the mare. The pack horse lasted only a day. When he stopped, Blue Duck made her get up behind him on the big sorrel. If it bothered the horse to carry two riders, he didn't show it. Lorena held on to the saddle strings and tried not to touch Blue Duck, although he paid her no mind. Riding at his back, she noticed something she had not seen before, a white necklace of some kind. It was a bone necklace, and after looking at it for a time, she realized it was made of fingers, human fingers. That evening when they stopped to rest, Blue Duck saw her glance at the necklace. He grinned in the way that made her think of death. "Easiest way to get the rings off," he said. "Just take the fingers. It's no harder than breaking off a little stick if you know how." That night he tied her hand and foot and rode off. Lorena didn't speak, didn't question him. Maybe he was leaving her for the buzzards, but she felt she'd rather die than say anything that might anger him. She didn't try to get untied either, for fear he was watching, waiting for her to make some attempt to escape. She slept, and she was awoke as he was cutting her bounds. Another horse was standing there. "It ain't much of a horse, but it's only got to last about a day," he said. There was no saddle. He had not bothered to take the saddle off the dying pack horse. He passed a cord under the horse's belly and tied her ankles. She had thought the riding hard even when she had a saddle, but quickly realized how easy that it had been. She slipped from side to side and had to cling on to the horse's mane to stay on. Blue Duck rode as before, seldom looking back. It was night and she was tired, but there was no dozing. Despite her grip on the mane, she almost slid off several times. With her feet tied, if she fell, she could just roll under the horse's belly and be kicked to death. The horse was narrow-backed and not very smooth-gaited. She could find no way to sit that didn't jar her, and long before morning she thought if they didn't stop, she'd be cut in two. But she wasn't, though her hands were raw from gripping the horsehair so tightly. Minute by minute, for hours, it seemed to her that she couldn't go on, that she might as well give up and slide under the animal's belly. There was no reason to stay alive anyway. Blue Duck had her. When he untied her at the creek, she stumbled in to get a drink, no longer caring if she got wet or muddy. Again, he gave her only a piece of hard, dried meat. She barely had the strength to get back on the horse. She had to claw her way up by using the mane. Blue Duck didn't help her, and he tied her ankles anyway, though it was obvious she was too weak to run away. She felt a flash of anger. Why did he keep tying her when she could barely walk? The country had begun to flatten out. The grass was higher than any she'd seen. When she looked up and flung the sweat out of her eyes, it seemed she could see a farther distance than she had ever seen before. Waves of heat shimmered over the grass. Once she looked up and thought she saw a giant tree far ahead, but when she looked again, it was gone. Blue Duck rode on through the high grass, never slowing, seldom looking back. She felt hatred growing, pushing through her fear. If she fell, he probably wouldn't even stop. He only wanted her for his men. He didn't care how much she hurt or how tired she was. He hadn't cared to keep her saddle or even her saddle blanket, though the blanket would have kept the horse's hard back from bruising her so. She felt like she had felt when she had tried to shoot Tinkersley. If she ever got a chance, she would kill the man, in revenge for all the painful hours she had spent watching his indifferent back. Well before sundown, they came to a broad river bend with just a little thin ribbon of brown water visible across an expanse of reddish sand. "Keep in my tracks," Blue Duck said. "If you don't, you're apt to bog." Just as he went about to put his horse into the sand, he held up. Across the river, Lorena saw 4 riders watching them. "It's Ermok and 3 of his boys," Blue Duck said. "I guess they've been off scalping." Lorena felt a chill just looking at the riders. Jake had said most of the Indians still running loose were renegades. He made light of them. He had dealt with renegades before, he said, and could do it again, except that he was still in Austin playing cards, and there were the renegades. She wanted to turn her horse and flee, hopeless as that was, but she sat in a cold sweat of fear. Blue Duck turned and caught her bridle, wrapping his reins around his saddle horn. They went cautiously across the sand, Blue Duck occasionally backtracking a few yards to find a route he liked better. Lorena kept her eyes down. She didn't want to look at the men waiting on the other side. Twice, despite all Blue Duck's caution, it seemed that they had gone wrong. His horse started to bog, and then hers, but both times, by heavy spurring, Blue Duck got the big sorrel to lunge free, pulling her horse free. Once, in one of the lunges, she was thrown far back on her horse's neck, but finally they found a solid crossing and trotted through the few yards of brown water. As they rode out of the river, the 4 men waiting whipped up their mounts and raced toward to meet them. One of them carried a lance strung with patches of hair. Lorena had never seen a scalp before, but she felt sure the patches were scalps. Most seemed old and dusty, but one patch of shiny black hair was still crusted with blood. All the men were Indians, heavily armed. The leader, who carried the lance with the collection of scalps, had a hard face, with a thin wisp of a mustache at each corner of his mouth. It was as if the hairs curled out of his mouth. She glanced only once and then kept her eyes away, for they were all looking at her with their looks that were bad. She knew she had come to a hard place and had no one to help her. She heard the leader speak to Blue Duck and then felt their horses crowd around her. Several hands reached out to feel and pull her hair. She could smell the men and feel them, but she didn't look up. She didn't want to see them. Their rank, sweaty smell was almost enough to make her sick. One of them, amused by her hair, pulled it till her scalp stung, and he laughed, a strange, jerky laugh. They crowded so close to her on their hot horses that for a moment she felt she might faint. She had never been in such a hard place, not even when the Mosby sisters locked her in the basement. 2 of the men dismounted, and one of them started to untie her ankles, but Blue Duck whistled. "Let's go," he said. "I reckon she'll keep till sundown." Ermok, the leader of the men with the wisps of hair at the corners of his mouth, retied her ankles so tightly that the rawhide cut her. He took her bridle and led her from then on. The other 3 men rode behind her. At the sight, Blue Duck laughed. "I guess they'll want to take no chances on you getting away," he said. "Fresh women is scarce in these parts." Lorena began to wish there was some way just to die. If there was, she would have done it. But she was tied and there was no way. They rode until the sun was gone and the western sky red with afterglow. Then Blue Duck reined in and quickly dropped the saddle off his horse. "Okay, Ermok," he said. "Go on. Have a taste. We'll stop until the moon rises." Before he had finished speaking, the men had cut her ankles free and were dragging her off the horse. They didn't even wait to tie their horses. When Lorena would open her eyes for a second, she saw the darkening sky through the legs of the waiting horses. The man with the jerky laugh had a bugle and also less lust than the rest. After covering her once, he sat in the grass playing the bugle calls. Now and then, watching what was happening, he would laugh the jerky laugh. Lorena expected death, but it wasn't death she got, just the 4 men. Ermok, the leader, wouldn't leave her. The other men began to complain. When she opened her eyes, she looked for the moon, but the moon was late, and she only saw the horses still standing over her. Blue Duck had gone away, and when he returned, Ermok was with her again. "Let's go," Blue Duck said. "That's enough of a taste." When Ermok ignored him, Blue Duck walked over and kicked him in the ribs so hard that Lorena was rolled over with the Indian. "You better mind," Blue Duck said. Ermok got up, holding his side. The man with the jerky laugh had a bugle, and also less lust than the rest. After covering her once, he sat in the grass playing bugle calls. Now and then, watching what was happening, he would laugh the jerky laugh. Lorena expected death, but it wasn't death she got, just the 4 men. Ermok, the leader, wouldn't leave her. The other men began to complain. When she opened her eyes, she looked for the moon, but the moon was late and she only saw the horses still standing over her. Blue Duck had gone away, and when he returned, Ermok was with her again. "Let's go," Blue Duck said. "That's enough of a taste." When Ermoke ignored him, Blue Duck walked over and kicked him in the ribs so hard that Lorena was rolled over with the Indian. "You better mind," Blue Duck said. Ermoke got up, holding his side. Well, they retied her ankles. The laughing bugler blew a few more notes.